The day had started like any other for Daniel. He was a single father who had learned to build his life around his daughter, Emily. Every morning he would prepare her lunch, braid her hair as best as he could, and walk her to school. His neighbors always admired the way he never complained, never showed exhaustion even though life had been far from easy for him. Losing his wife years ago had left a gap that nothing could fill. But Daniel promised himself he would become both father and mother to Emily. That promise guided every step of his day. On this particular afternoon, Daniel was returning from the grocery store carrying a bag filled with bread, milk, and Emily's favorite cereal. The street near the hospital was crowded as usual. People hurried in and out, doctors walked briskly, and patients sat waiting in the small garden nearby. Everything felt ordinary until Daniel noticed something unusual in the corner of his eye. Sudden cry broke through the steady noise of the street. It was not a cry of pain, but one of fear. Daniel turned his head and saw a nurse standing frozen near the hospital entrance. In front of her stood a man dressed in dark clothes, his face hidden under a hood. His body language carried aggression, his hand gripping something metallic that glinted under the afternoon sun. Daniel's heart raced. It took him only a moment to realize it was a knife. The nurse, no older than her mid-20s, had fear written all over her face. Her hands trembled as she instinctively stepped back, but the stranger moved closer, his voice low but threatening. People nearby gasped, yet no one moved forward. Fear held everyone still. Mothers clutched their children, patients tried to pull away, and security guards at the gate were a step too far to react quickly. At that moment, Daniel felt a wave of something stronger than fear. He felt responsibility. It was not his duty to get involved. No one would blame him if he walked away, if he stayed silent like the rest of the crowd. But Daniel thought of Emily. What lesson would he be teaching his daughter if he turned his back on someone in need? He had always told her, real strength is not about muscles. It is about courage. And now, his own words echoed inside him. Without thinking twice, Daniel dropped the grocery bag to the ground. The bread rolled onto the pavement and the milk carton burst open, spilling white liquid near his feet. His eyes locked on the nurse, who looked as though she was moments away from collapsing. Daniel pushed his way through the small crowd and stepped directly between the hooded man and the nurse. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice loud enough to cut through the tension. "You can't touch her." The hooded man hesitated, clearly surprised by Daniel's sudden appearance. His hand, gripping the knife tightly, shook slightly. He had expected fear, not defiance. Daniel's body trembled inside, but his face remained firm. He knew very well he was risking his own safety. He could feel the eyes of strangers fixed on him, whispers spreading quickly. He did not care. In that moment, the only thing that mattered was shielding someone who could not protect herself. The nurse let out a shaky breath, her eyes filling with tears. She clutched her chest, unable to speak, but her gaze told Daniel she understood what he was doing. "Step aside," the hooded man growled. Daniel did not move. Instead, he took a firm step forward, narrowing the distance between himself and danger. "If you want to harm her, you'll have to go through me first," he said. His voice was steady, but deep inside his chest, his heart pounded like a drum. The knife glinted again as the man raised it higher. Gasps filled the air. Daniel clenched his fists, ready to defend himself the only way he knew, by refusing to give in. He had faced many battles in life, but none had been like this. Losing his wife had nearly broken him, yet he survived for his daughter's sake. Now, standing in front of this nurse, he felt the same determination rising inside him. The attacker lunged forward slightly, pressing the knife dangerously close to Daniel's chest. For a moment, it seemed the world stopped moving. Daniel felt the cold metal just inches from his skin. Pain might come next, but he refused to step back. His jaw tightened, his eyes burned with a mix of anger and courage, and his entire presence screamed one message: "You will not win today." Behind him, the nurse whispered, "Please, be careful," her voice barely audible. Daniel tilted his head slightly, enough for her to hear him. "It's going to be okay," he said softly. The hooded man snarled, but his movements grew uncertain. He had expected to frighten, to dominate, to make the crowd scatter. Instead, he faced a man who refused to move, a man who stood as if rooted to the ground by something unshakable. And then, as if on cue, hospital security rushed forward. They had finally closed the distance and were ready to intervene. Seeing them, the hooded man panicked, pushing against Daniel. The blade nicked his shirt, scratching his skin enough to leave a mark. Daniel winced but did not fall. He held his ground, giving the guards the opening they needed. Within seconds, the man was disarmed and restrained. The knife clattered onto the pavement, the sound ringing in everyone's ears like an exhale of relief. The crowd burst into murmurs, some clapping, others shouting words of praise. The nurse rushed to Daniel's side, tears streaming down her face. "You saved me," she whispered, placing her hand gently on his arm. Daniel gave a tired smile. "Anyone would have done the same," he said. But in his heart, he knew not everyone would have. His daughter's face flashed before his eyes again. He thought of how proud she would be if she knew her father had chosen bravery over fear. He thought of how important it was to live the lessons he wanted her to carry into adulthood. The nurse guided him toward a nearby bench, urging him to sit. His shirt bore a faint bloodstain where the knife had grazed him, but Daniel waved it off. "I'm fine," he insisted, though the sting reminded him of how close he had come to real danger. The hospital staff surrounded him, thanking him, praising him, calling him a hero. But Daniel shook his head. He was not a hero, not in his own eyes. He was just a father who had stepped forward when it mattered. As he sat catching his breath, he looked at the nurse who was still trembling. He saw in her eyes a reflection of his late wife, someone who dedicated her life to helping others. And for a brief second, Daniel felt as though his wife's spirit had guided him to step forward. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting golden light over the hospital. The chaos had ended, but the story was only beginning. Daniel did not know it yet, but the simple act of courage he had shown that afternoon would spread beyond this street, beyond this hospital. By tomorrow, his name would carry across the city. And the life he had fought so hard to build for Emily would never be the same again. For now, though, he sat quietly, looking at the spilled milk and crushed bread on the pavement. It seemed like such a small sacrifice for what had been protected. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but whispers of his bravery lingered in the air. People would go home that night and tell their families about the man who stepped in when no one else did. And Daniel, though exhausted, felt a calmness settle over him. He had kept his promise, to himself, to his daughter, and to the values he lived by. Fear had come face to face with love, and love had won. Daniel spent the rest of that evening in the hospital under observation. The cut on his chest was not deep, but the doctors insisted he should stay for the night just to make sure he was fine. He kept telling them he was okay, that he needed to get home to his daughter Emily, but the nurse he had protected, whose name he learned was Sarah, stood by him with a firm expression. "You have to rest," she said gently, and there was something in her tone that reminded Daniel of his late wife, the way she used to insist he take care of himself even when he felt he did not need it. That memory kept him quiet, though his heart longed to see Emily and assure her that everything was fine. As he lay on the hospital bed, Daniel's thoughts wandered to the moment he had stood face to face with danger. He could still feel the cold steel of the knife brushing against his chest, the weight of the stranger's hostility pressing down on him. Yet what he remembered most clearly was not fear, but the strange calm that had taken hold of him. It was not that he was unafraid. It was that something stronger than fear had anchored him in place. It was the silent strength of love, the knowledge that if he turned away, if he let harm come to another, he would be betraying everything he wanted his daughter to believe in. That silent strength had guided him more than any physical ability could. The night was quiet in his hospital room, broken only by the occasional beeping of a monitor and the muffled footsteps of nurses outside. Sarah came in a few times to check on him, her gratitude still shining in her eyes. "I do not know what would have happened if you had not stepped in," she said softly once, adjusting the blanket over him. Daniel only smiled faintly and replied, "Sometimes we are placed in a moment we cannot walk away from. I did what anyone should have done." But in his heart he knew that not everyone would have done it. Most people would have turned their eyes away, hoping someone else would take responsibility. That was what made Daniel different. He had spent years carrying the responsibility of raising his daughter alone, shouldering grief while building strength out of necessity. He had learned to live without complaint, to wake up each day ready, to face whatever came, even if his heart still ached for the woman he had lost. Responsibility was not new to him. It had become his silent companion. And in that moment outside the hospital, that companion had whispered to him, "You must stand your ground." Emily, meanwhile, had been staying at her neighbor's house for the evening. Daniel had called quickly to let her know he was safe, careful, not to frighten her with details. "Daddy just had to help someone today, but I am fine," he said over the phone. Emily's small voice trembled, but she trusted him. She always did. That trust gave Daniel comfort, though he knew that sooner or later she would hear the story from someone else. When she did, he hoped she would understand that his actions had not been reckless, but necessary. He wanted her to see that courage was not about being fearless, but about standing up when someone else cannot. The hours passed slowly, and though he tried to close his eyes, Daniel found himself replaying the event again and again. What struck him was not just his own decision, but the reaction of the people around him. So many had been frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. He did not judge them. Fear was natural. But he thought about how one person's choice to move forward could break that paralysis, could turn fear into action. By stepping forward, he had changed the ending of that moment. That thought stayed with him, stirring something deep inside his heart. The next morning, Daniel woke to the sound of birds outside his window. Sunlight streamed into the hospital room, and for the first time in hours, he felt a strange sense of peace. His chest still ached, but his spirit felt stronger. Sarah entered with a smile and a tray of breakfast. "Good morning, hero," she teased lightly. Daniel chuckled and shook his head. "Please do not call me that," he said. "I am just a father who did what he had to." But Sarah insisted. "Sometimes ordinary people remind the world what true heroes look like. You reminded us yesterday." Her words made Daniel quiet. He thought about the word hero and how lightly it was often used in movies or stories. He had never considered himself anything close to that. He was simply a man trying to raise his daughter, trying to survive one day at a time. Yet, as he sat there listening to Sarah, he realized that maybe being a hero was not about glory or recognition. Maybe it was about those small, crucial moments when you choose love over fear, when you decide that protecting another life is worth any risk. By the time Daniel was discharged later that morning, news of the incident had already begun to spread. Patients had told their families, staff had shared it with friends, and the story of the single father who stepped in front of a nurse had begun to ripple through the community. Daniel, unaware of the extent, walked slowly out of the hospital, clutching the small bag of his belongings. He only wanted to get home to Emily, to hug her tightly and reassure her. That was all that mattered to him. On the bus ride home, he sat quietly by the window, watching the city pass by. People were busy with their lives, rushing to work, crossing streets, carrying shopping bags. Most of them did not know him, nor did they know what he had done. And yet somewhere in this same city, his story was already being retold, already inspiring conversations about courage, about standing up for others. Daniel did not seek that attention. He did not even imagine it. For him, the act was behind him. What lay ahead was his duty to his daughter. When he reached his street, Emily came running out of the neighbor's house, her small arms wrapping tightly around his waist. "Daddy!" she cried. Daniel knelt down, holding her close, closing his eyes as relief washed over him. "I am here, my love," he whispered. "I am not going anywhere." That embrace reminded him once again why he had stepped forward the previous day. It was not about bravery for the world. It was about being the man his daughter believed him to be. She believed in his strength, in his kindness, in his willingness to do the right thing. And Daniel knew he could never betray that belief. That night, after tucking Emily into bed, Daniel sat by the window of their small home. The moonlight spilled across the room and the quiet of the night wrapped around him. He thought again of Sarah's words, of how she had called him a hero. He still did not feel like one, but he did feel grateful. Grateful for the chance to show his daughter what real courage looked like. Grateful to have survived the test. Grateful to know that even in the silence of fear, strength could rise. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but Daniel felt a certainty deep in his heart that the world around him had shifted in a way he could not yet see. What he had done had not only saved a nurse, it had touched the hearts of many. And that silent strength, born from love and responsibility, was about to echo louder than he ever imagined. Daniel woke before sunrise the next day, his body still sore but his mind restless. The world outside was quiet, wrapped in the soft gray of dawn, but inside his heart there was a storm of thoughts. He looked over at his daughter Emily, still asleep in her small bed with her blanket tucked around her shoulders. Her little hand rested against her cheek, and her breathing was steady and calm. For a moment, Daniel just sat there watching her, realizing once again that she was the reason he could face anything in life. He had faced grief, loneliness, endless responsibilities, and yesterday he had faced danger itself. Every time it was her face, her presence, her future that gave him the courage to stand tall. He remembered the promise he had made years ago, right after his wife passed away. Emily had been only 4 years old then, too young to understand why her mother never came back from the hospital, too young to understand why her father cried silently at night when he thought she was asleep. Daniel had stood in their small living room one evening, holding Emily in his arms, and whispered a vow. "I will protect you. I will raise you with love, and I will never walk away from doing what is right." That vow became his anchor, shaping every decision he made. The events of yesterday replayed in his mind again and again. The flash of the knife, the trembling of the nurse, the gasps of the crowd. He wondered what Emily would think if she truly knew how close he had come to harm. Would she be proud? Would she be angry at him for taking such a risk? These questions pressed heavily on his mind, but underneath them was a steady current of peace, because deep down Daniel knew he had acted as a father should. He had acted in a way that Emily could look back on one day and understand that love sometimes demands sacrifice. That morning, as the sun rose higher, Daniel made breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, simple but filling. Emily sat at the table, rubbing her eyes sleepily. "Daddy," she asked softly, "are you really okay?" He smiled at her, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Just a little scratch, nothing more." She looked at him with wide, searching eyes as though trying to read the truth behind his words. Children always know more than we think, and Emily was no different. She nodded but stayed quiet, holding her toast in small hands. As they ate, Daniel realized that fatherhood was more than just providing food or shelter. It was about giving your child a sense of safety in a world that often felt unsafe. It was about teaching them values, not through lectures but through actions. Yesterday had been dangerous, but it had also been a lesson. One day Emily would grow up, and he wanted her to carry with her the understanding that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to protect others despite it. Later that morning, Sarah, the nurse, came by their small home. She carried a basket filled with fruit and bread, insisting it was just a small thank you. Emily peeked from behind Daniel's arm, curious about the visitor. Sarah bent down, smiling warmly at her. "Your father is very brave," she said gently. Emily clung to Daniel's shirt but listened carefully. Daniel cleared his throat and shook his head. "I only did what I had to," he replied. But Sarah insisted, The world needs people who do what they have to. That is what makes it safer for the rest of us. After she left, Daniel thought about the strange way life works. You can wake up expecting a normal day, and by evening you are faced with a choice that defines you. He did not plan to be in that moment outside the hospital, but life had placed him there, and his heart had guided him to act. He realized that fatherhood had prepared him more than anything else could have. Being a father meant always standing in front of danger, always placing someone else's safety above your own. It meant carrying burdens silently so your child could laugh freely. As the day went on, Daniel noticed something unusual. Neighbors stopped by to check on him, some bringing food, others just offering words of admiration. They all seemed to know what had happened. Word had spread faster than he could have imagined. People praised his bravery, calling him an inspiration, but Daniel found it hard to accept their compliments. He felt no pride, only humility. To him it was simple. A father's heart cannot ignore someone in danger. That evening, Daniel sat with Emily on the porch. The air was cool, and the sky glowed orange with the setting sun. Emily leaned against him, her small voice breaking the silence. "Daddy, why did you help that nurse if you didn't even know her?" Daniel looked at her, choosing his words carefully. "Because, my love, she is someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. And if you were ever in trouble, I would hope someone would protect you too. We do not need to know someone to do what is right." Emily thought about his words, then smiled faintly. "I think Mommy would be proud of you," she said softly. Tears welled in Daniel's eyes, though he blinked them away quickly. Hearing his daughter say those words touched him deeper than anything else could. His wife's absence still weighed heavily on his soul, but knowing Emily carried her memory and connected it to his actions made him feel as though his late wife was still guiding them both. Night settled once again, and Daniel tucked Emily into bed, kissing her forehead. As she drifted to sleep, he sat by her side, whispering quietly, "I will always protect you, no matter what." His words were both a promise and a prayer, echoing into the quiet of their small home. Daniel did not realize it yet, but his actions had planted seeds in the hearts of many. His choice to step forward had not only saved a nurse, but had reminded an entire community of what courage and compassion look like. The father's heart that guided him yesterday was about to open doors to something much larger than himself. The ripples of his bravery had only just begun, and soon they would return to him in ways he never expected. Daniel's body healed quickly, but inside, his thoughts remained unsettled. Days after the incident outside the hospital, he found himself caught between silence and noise. On the surface, life seemed to return to its ordinary rhythm. He prepared Emily's school bag every morning, walked her to the corner bus stop, and came back home to the chores waiting for him. Yet beneath those ordinary routines lived a quiet storm. Every time he passed the hospital gates, every time he saw nurses rushing in and out in their crisp uniforms, he felt the memory of that moment press against his chest, like a shadow that refused to leave. The cut on his shirt had already been stitched, and the mark on his chest was fading, but the weight of what had happened lingered. He had not spoken much about it. He did not tell his neighbors the details when they asked, nor did he allow himself to sit down with Emily and explain everything. He thought perhaps silence was better. Why place the burden of fear on others when he could carry it alone? But silence has its own kind of heaviness, and Daniel felt it settling deeper each night. Sometimes, after Emily had gone to bed, Daniel would sit in the living room with the lights dimmed, replaying the scene in his mind. He could still hear the sharp intake of breath from the nurse, the collective gasp of the crowd, the quick rush of adrenaline that had carried him forward. What haunted him most was not the knife, nor even the pain. It was the moment of choice. That single second when he could have turned away, when his legs could have carried him to safety, that second had defined everything. And the question that followed him silently was, what if I had not stepped forward? He imagined the nurse's terrified eyes, the fear that would have deepened if no one had intervened. He imagined Emily one day asking him about courage, and what story would he have told her if he had walked away? That thought alone was unbearable. The silence inside his heart was filled with these questions, echoing louder than any applause or praise he had received. Sarah, the nurse, came to visit again. She brought more than fruit this time. She brought a simple card, handwritten, with words of gratitude. "You do not have to read it now," she said, leaving it on his table. Her presence was quiet, respectful, but Daniel could see that she too carried the memory heavily. She had been saved, yes, but she had also lived through fear that cut deeper than any blade. As she left, she looked at him with eyes that seemed to say, "You carried me through the darkest moment." Daniel held the card later that night, reading her words carefully. She wrote about how she had chosen nursing because she wanted to help people, how she had believed in compassion, but never expected to be the one needing it. She called him her guardian angel, though Daniel shook his head at the title. He did not feel like an angel. He felt like a man simply caught in the middle of a storm. Yet reading her words filled him with a strange strength. Maybe the silence he was battling inside was not meant to be fought alone. Maybe in saving her they had both become part of a story larger than themselves. Emily noticed the quietness in her father. Children always sense what adults try to hide. One evening, while Daniel sat on the porch staring into the distance, Emily climbed onto his lap and asked, "Daddy, do you ever feel scared?" Daniel was taken aback. He looked into her curious eyes, knowing that she deserved honesty. "Yes, sweetheart," he said softly. "I do feel scared, but I try to be brave even when I am." She thought about this and nodded slowly, as if storing the lesson deep inside her heart. Then she whispered, "I think that is what makes you strong." Her words were like a light in his silence. Daniel realized that he did not need to hide his fears from her. Showing her that courage was about facing fear, not denying it, was perhaps the greatest gift he could give her. That night, as he tucked her into bed, he felt the silent battle inside him shift slightly. The silence was still there, but now it carried meaning. The days stretched on, and the whispers in the neighborhood grew louder. People spoke of his bravery at shops, at bus stops, at church on Sunday. Some wanted to shake his hand, others wanted to hear the story from his lips. But Daniel kept his words few, not out of pride, but because he did not believe courage needed retelling. To him it had been a moment, and it was finished. What he did not realize was that his silence made his story echo even more. The less he spoke, the more others carried, the tale forward, shaping it into something powerful. One evening, as he was returning from buying groceries, Daniel overheard two strangers talking near the hospital. "Did you hear about the single father who stood up to protect that nurse? People say he blocked the knife with his own body." The other man shook his head in disbelief. "That kind of courage. You do not see it anymore." Daniel walked past them quietly, not revealing his identity. He felt no need to step into their conversation. Hearing their words was enough to remind him that his choice had left a mark far beyond his own life. The true battle was not on the street that day. It was inside Daniel now. It was the battle between the man who wanted to remain ordinary and the role others were placing upon him. Hero, angel, savior. These words felt heavy. All he wanted was to be a father raising his daughter in peace. But perhaps, he thought, the world sometimes chooses its heroes, not the other way around. In the quiet of his small home, Daniel came to accept something important. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the space where meaning grows. His silence after the incident was not weakness. It was reflection. It was the weight of responsibility settling deeper into his soul, and in that silence, a new strength was taking shape, preparing him for what was yet to come. Daniel did not know it yet, but the battle in silence was only the beginning. The next dawn would bring voices far louder than the whispers he heard. Now, the story he had tried to keep small was already spreading like fire, and soon silence would no longer belong to him. The night crept slowly over the town, wrapping the streets in a blanket of quietness. In Daniel's small home, The soft hum of the ceiling fan filled the silence as Emily slept peacefully in her room. Daniel sat alone at the kitchen table, the dim light casting long shadows across the walls. His hands rested on the wooden surface, still rough from years of hard work. He had carried heavy boxes, fixed broken furniture, worked long hours in warehouses, anything that could put food on the table. But none of those struggles compared to the weight he carried now, the invisible weight of expectation and gratitude that the world seemed to place on him since that day outside the hospital. He thought about Sarah, the nurse, and the way her voice had trembled when she thanked him. He thought about the card she had given him, sitting carefully on the counter beside the fruit she had brought. He had read it twice already, each word soaking into his heart. Her words were simple, but filled with truth. She believed her life had been saved not just by his action, but by his willingness to care for someone he didn't know. That idea stirred something in him. It made him realize how healing does not always come from doctors or medicine. Sometimes healing begins with kindness, with courage, with one human being choosing to protect another. The night stretched on, and Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. His body was still tired, but his mind wandered restlessly. He felt as if his heart was split into two worlds. One part longed for peace, for the quiet rhythm of life with Emily, for mornings of laughter and evenings of homework at the kitchen table. The other part was restless, sensing that life had shifted, that he could not go back to being invisible. He had stood up once, and now people saw him differently. Some called him brave, others called him a hero. But Daniel wondered, what if courage was not about what the world saw? What if courage was simply about staying true to the heart, even when no one was watching? That night, as the hours passed, Daniel finally rose and walked into Emily's room. She was curled up under her blanket, her small teddy bear pressed tightly against her chest. Daniel sat gently on the edge of her bed and brushed a strand of hair away from her forehead. She stirred slightly but did not wake. Looking at her, Daniel felt his heart settle. Everything he had done, every risk he had taken, every scar he carried, was for her. He whispered softly, "You are my reason, Emily. Always." Those words melted into the night, unheard by anyone but himself. Outside, the stars shone faintly, hidden behind thin clouds. The world seemed unaware of the battle Daniel carried in his chest. Yet healing often begins in quiet places. And that night, healing began not just for Sarah, not just for Emily, but for Daniel too. He realized that healing was not only about wounds closing or pain fading. Healing was also about finding meaning in suffering, about turning fear into lessons and scars into stories of hope. As Daniel returned to his chair, he found himself remembering the early years after his wife's passing. Nights when he sat alone in the dark, overwhelmed by grief, unsure if he could raise a child alone. Nights when he felt like the world was too heavy for his shoulders. Yet somehow, every morning, he rose again. Somehow, he found the strength to keep moving one step at a time. That strength had never come from pride or power. It had come from love. And now, years later, it was love again that had pushed him in front of danger. The night of healing was not just about recovering from what had happened at the hospital. It was about Daniel coming to terms with who he was becoming. He realized that being a father was more than just protecting Emily. It was about showing her how to live with courage, how to treat others with compassion, how to carry responsibility with dignity. She was watching him even when she didn't speak. She was learning from his silence, from his choices, from his sacrifices. And that realization brought him both peace and purpose. As the clock ticked past midnight, Daniel brewed himself a cup of tea. The warm steam rose gently, carrying with it a calmness he had not felt in days. He sat by the window, looking out at the quiet street. The houses were dark, the world asleep, but Daniel felt awake in a new way. He felt alive with understanding that the path of healing was not just his own. The nurse was healing. The community was healing. And even Emily, in her own innocent way, was healing too. Because when one person chooses love over fear, It creates ripples that touch everyone nearby. He thought about how doctors and nurses spend their lives healing others, often at great cost to themselves. And yet, in one strange twist of fate, a nurse had needed someone to heal her, not with medicine but with courage. He thought about the irony of it all, and it made him smile faintly. Perhaps healing is not about who has the knowledge or the skill, but about who is willing to step forward at the right moment. Daniel finished his tea and closed his eyes for a moment. The silence of the house wrapped around him, no longer heavy, but gentle. It was the silence of rest, of acceptance, of healing. For the first time since the incident, Daniel felt the storm inside him calm. He did not know what tomorrow would bring. He did not know how the world would react to his story as it spread. But he knew one thing with certainty, that love would continue to guide him no matter how heavy the days ahead became. The night of healing ended not with applause, not with recognition, but with the quiet strength of a father sitting alone, in his home, finding peace in the simple truth that courage and love are the greatest medicine of all. Morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of Daniel's modest home. The golden glow stretched across the floorboards and touched the edge of Emily's bed as she stirred awake. Daniel was already up, standing at the stove in the kitchen, frying eggs the way Emily liked them. The sizzle of the pan filled the room, mixing with the faint chirping of birds outside. It felt like a normal morning, the kind Daniel craved after so many restless nights. Yet something about the air carried a weight he couldn't quite explain. Emily walked in rubbing her eyes, her teddy bear still tucked under one arm. "Good morning, Daddy," she mumbled sleepily. Daniel smiled and kissed the top of her head. "Good morning, love. Breakfast is almost ready." She climbed into her chair at the table, her hair messy, her cheeks warm from sleep. Daniel watched, her with quiet joy. These were the moments he lived for, the small, ordinary snapshots of fatherhood that reminded him life was still beautiful, despite the storms he had faced. But as they ate together, a faint noise drifted into the house. At first Daniel ignored it, thinking it was just traffic or construction from down the street. Then it grew louder, like a low hum of voices blending together. He glanced at the window and frowned. It was unusual for the street to be this noisy, so early in the morning. Emily noticed his distracted look. "What is it, Daddy?" she asked, tilting her head. Daniel shook his head gently. "Probably nothing. Finish your eggs." But curiosity tugged at him. After clearing the dishes, Daniel walked toward the door. He opened it slowly, expecting perhaps a delivery truck or maybe a few neighbors talking. Instead, his breath caught in his throat. The street outside his home was lined with people, dozens at first glance, then hundreds as his eyes adjusted to the sight. Men and women in white coats stood shoulder to shoulder, nurses with stethoscopes around their necks, doctors with clipboards tucked under their arms, medical students holding handwritten signs. They filled the sidewalk, stretched across the road, their presence spilling into every corner his eyes could see. For a moment, Daniel thought he was dreaming. He stepped outside, the morning air cool against his skin, and the hum of voices softened into silence as the crowd noticed him. Then, as if carried by one heartbeat, applause erupted. A wave of clapping hands, of cheering voices, of gratitude pouring out into the quiet neighborhood. Emily ran to the door behind him, her small eyes widening at the sight. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging his hand. Daniel's heart pounded as he took in the scene. He had never seen so many doctors and nurses gathered in one place outside a hospital. Some held banners that read, "A hero lives here." Others carried placards with simple words like "Thank you and courage inspires." A few had even brought flowers, holding them gently, as if offering them to a man who did not yet understand why he deserved them. From the center of the crowd, Sarah stepped forward. Her nurse's uniform was neatly pressed and her eyes glistened with emotion. In her hands she carried a bouquet of white lilies. She walked toward Daniel, her step steady though her lips trembled as she tried to find words. Finally she stopped in front of him and held out the flowers. "We wanted you to know," she said softly, her voice carrying over the hush of the crowd, that what you did will never be forgotten. Daniel stared at her, at the faces behind her, at the sea of medical professionals who had chosen to gather outside his small home. His throat tightened. He opened his mouth, but no words came. He was a simple man, a father, not someone used to attention, not someone who sought recognition. To stand there as hundreds of people honored him felt overwhelming, almost unreal. He looked down at Emily, whose eyes sparkled with pride, and suddenly everything made sense. He cleared his throat and spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "I didn't do it for recognition," he said quietly, but the crowd heard him. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. Because I want my daughter to grow up believing that we must protect each other. If someone is in danger, we don't turn away." His words carried into the silence, and for a brief moment even the birds seemed to stop singing. Then the applause began again, louder, stronger, echoing down the street like thunder. Emily clutched his arm tightly, her face glowing with pride. She had always seen her father as strong, but now she saw how the world saw him too. For her, this was the morning she would never forget. The morning when her father's courage was not just their private story, but a story the whole community shared. Neighbors peeked from windows, some joining the crowd, others waving from porches. The entire street seemed to come alive with the spirit of gratitude. Children held up drawings of hearts and shields. Elderly patients who had once been treated in that very hospital stood with canes, tears streaming down their cheeks. Doctors who had spent their lives saving others now stood to honor the man who had saved one of their own. Daniel accepted the flowers from Sarah, his hands trembling. "Thank you," he whispered. But inside, he still struggled. He did not see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a father who had acted on instinct, guided by love. Yet perhaps he thought this was what the world needed to remember, that ordinary people could be extraordinary when they chose love over fear. The morning stretched on as more voices rose, as more people came forward to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him their lives were touched by his story. Daniel listened humbly, nodding, offering small smiles. Through it all, Emily never left his side, her hand firmly in his. And deep within, Daniel knew that this was not just about him. It was about reminding everyone present that courage was not something distant, not something reserved for the strong or the trained. It was something every heart carried, waiting for the moment it was needed. That morning's surprise became a turning point. For Daniel, it was the day he realized his silent act had become a voice for many. For Emily, it was the day she saw her father, not just as her hero, but as someone who had awakened courage in an entire community. And for the doctors and nurses, it was the day they remembered that healing does not always come from medicine, but from the bravery of ordinary souls who choose to stand in the gap when others cannot. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, Daniel stood at the doorway of his home, Emily's small hand still tucked in his. The street grew quieter, but the echo of the applause lingered in his ears. He looked at his daughter, and she looked back at him with a smile that seemed to carry all the light in the world. And in that moment, Daniel felt something he had not felt in years. Hope rising strong and unshakable, like the morning sun climbing higher in the sky. The applause of that morning still echoed in Daniel's memory long after the doctors and nurses had left his street. For days he carried the weight of their gratitude, the sound of their clapping hands following him like a shadow. Every corner shop he visited, every neighbor he greeted, someone always mentioned what he had done. At first it unsettled him. He had never been a man who sought attention. He preferred the quiet life, where his greatest pride was watching Emily smile. Yet now the world had placed him under a light he had never expected. In the evenings, Daniel would sit with Emily on the porch while the sun sank low behind the houses. Children played in the street, chasing one another, laughter ringing through the air. Emily often leaned against him, her eyes glowing with pride as she retold the story in her own words. "My daddy is the bravest man in the world," she would say to her friends, her voice filled with certainty. Daniel would chuckle softly, embarrassed yet warmed by her faith in him. For her, the story was not about a knife or a nurse. For her, the story was about love, her father's love that refused to let fear win. The story spread further than Daniel ever imagined. Local newspapers carried headlines about the single father who had stepped into danger. Radio stations spoke of his courage. Even schools used his act as an example, teaching children about standing up for what is right. Letters began arriving at his home, some from people he had never met, thanking him for inspiring them, others from children who drew pictures of him as a hero with a shield. Each letter touched him deeply, though he never stopped telling Emily,
"I am not a hero, I am just your dad." But Emily would always shake her head. "That's why you are a hero," she whispered.
And Daniel began to realize something important. Heroism was not about medals or fame. It was not about perfect strength or fearless hearts. It was about love lived out in real actions, about choosing to protect others even when fear trembled in your bones. One evening, Sarah visited again. This time she came not in uniform but in simple clothes, her eyes carrying peace that had not been there before. She sat at Daniel's table sipping tea and spoke quietly. "Do you know what you gave me that day? Not just safety. You gave me hope again. I had been losing faith in people and kindness, but you reminded me that goodness still lives in the world." Daniel listened, humbled, his gaze dropping to the table. "I only did what I had to," he said, but Sarah smiled. "That's the point. The world changes when ordinary people do what they have to." Those words stayed with him long after she left. He thought about the legacy he wanted to leave for Emily. Not money, not possessions. Those could disappear. What he wanted her to inherit was courage, kindness, and a heart that never turned away from those in need. That legacy mattered more than anything else. As weeks turned into months, Daniel noticed changes around him. His neighbors seemed kinder to one another. Strangers offered help more freely. It was as if his one act had reminded the community of their shared humanity. At the hospital, staff continued to talk about him, not as a man with superhuman strength, but as proof that courage could come from anywhere. And Daniel, though he remained humble, understood that the legacy of his choice had grown larger than himself. Emily often asked him questions that revealed the depth of her young mind. "Daddy, were you afraid?" she asked one night as they sat under the stars. Daniel thought for a long moment before answering. "Yes, Emily, I was afraid, but I knew I had to be brave anyway." She nodded slowly, her little hand slipping into his. "Then I'll be brave too," she whispered. And in that moment, Daniel saw his legacy already alive in her. Years later, Emily would tell the story again and again. She would tell it not as a tale of violence, but as a tale of love. She would remind people that her father once stood when no one else did, and that his courage was born not from strength, but from devotion. And every time she told it, she kept alive the lesson he had lived, that fear does not define us. Love does. Daniel's life did not suddenly become easy. Bills still needed paying. Work was still tiring. There were still nights of exhaustion and mornings of worry. But something inside him had shifted. He carried himself differently, not with pride, but with quiet assurance. He had faced the worst of fear and chosen love, and that choice had become a legacy for his daughter, for his neighbors, for his community. The legacy beyond fear was not about the crowd outside his home, not about the applause or the headlines. It was about the ripple effect of a single act of courage. It was about the way Emily's eyes lit up when she spoke of him. It was about Sarah finding hope again. It was about strangers remembering that humanity still had light in it. That was the true legacy, one that could not be erased by time. As Daniel sat one evening watching Emily play with her friends, he felt peace settle in his heart. He thought of his late wife, wondering if she could see them now. He imagined her smile, her gentle voice saying, "You kept your promise." Tears pricked his eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of fulfillment. He had carried his family through storms, and though life would always bring challenges, He had given Emily something no hardship could take away, the memory of a father who stood firm in love. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Daniel breathed deeply, the cool air filling his lungs, the warmth of his daughter's laughter filling his soul. And in that moment, he knew that even when he was gone, even when his story faded into whispers, the legacy of his choice would remain. Because courage rooted in love never dies. It becomes part of those who witness it, part of those who are inspired by it, part of those who carry it forward. A single father had blocked a knife one day, but what he truly blocked was despair, fear, and hopelessness. What he opened instead was a path of courage that others could walk. That was his legacy, the legacy beyond fear.